Well, my name's Stuart Candy. I'm Director of Situation Lab and Associate Professor in the School of Design at Carnegie-Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My area of interest as a professional futurist and a storyteller and an educator and an experienced designer is really in how to enable people and invite them effectively to think and feel their way into future possibilities in a higher resolution and more effective way. At Situation Lab, we say that we design situations for the public good, for clients, and for kicks. Not necessarily in that order, but what we're the framing of Situation Lab, in a sense, aims to draw attention to a design space of at the scale of the situation. So we try to design situations that are enabling of creativity and insight and higher quality conversation than might otherwise be the case in some form or fashion. So the work that I've been particularly interested in for the last 15 years or so really revolves around animating futures, possible future worlds and circumstances in the public mind, and seeding and encouraging civic imagination and social foresight, a collective capacity to think ahead. And this initiative, Imagined, really represents one of the first concerted efforts to institutionalize and regularize and properly embed those moves as on a national and international scale. So there's a kind of a perfect fit of or alignment of vision, in a sense, there, and of approach. I think the other reason is that there are just fantastic individuals involved with this, and when someone who you want to work with asks you to work with them, you say yes. You find a way to make it happen. Yeah, so when I think about this question of what our field of work might look like in a decade's time, I suppose I have to start by parsing that a little bit, because it depends what aspect or focus we're actually talking about. If we're talking about the capacity to think about futures through design, through the media, through theater and the arts and film, and all of the ways in which ideas about the future can be brought to life, that kind of capacity level of what we do, it gets a little bit recursive or meta. It's like, well, when we imagine 10 years in the future, how will we be imagining 10 years in the future? But when we think more about the kind of some of the thematic focus areas that we're interested in, the one that I think is immensely important to me and has shown up in some of our recent work is climate action. So we recently completed a project in collaboration with IFTF and the World Bank Climate Investment Funds called United States Earth Force, which is about a hypothetical sixth branch of the United States military, founded in our telling, in our scenario, in the year 2029, as a kind of belated effort to have the massively powerful apparatus of the US federal government taking climate seriously at last. Now, that's not a preferred future necessarily, and it's not a prediction either. It's a provocation about the path that things are currently on, and the notion there is to make the possibility space more thinkable by creating designed instances of experiences from within that possibility space experienceable today. One thing that I think, another topic that I think is incredibly important for mainstream Western political culture in general and settler colonial cultures of the kind that I'm most familiar with in particular to deal with is the relationship between those cultures and the indigenous peoples that they have displaced and marginalized over their histories. So I was born in Australia and raised there and a little bit in Canada, and I've spent almost my whole adult life in the US, Canada, and Hawaii, a little bit in Britain and Europe. But the question of how that relationship looks 10 years from now, or in a preferred mode where its dysfunctions have been acknowledged and owned up to, I think takes us to questions of politics and law that have not been adequately imagined, let alone discussed in a public way. So things like truth and reconciliation commissions established in each of these polities, or treaties being promulgated and honored, and official apologies in those places where they haven't happened yet, and discussions of reparations and making amends. I think all of those things would be components of a landscape that for me, you know, I tend to come back to politics and to law because that's partly where my training is, but I think it's also where the levers are for society to try to re-engineer its what's wrong with its culture. And so those would be examples of specific things that need to be reimagined, while the sort of capacity layer of how to do that reimagining is the skill set or the approach, the set of approaches that I suppose we've been practicing all this time. So on the front of the augmenting our collective capacity to think about and narrate alternative futures, I think one of the sites of experimentation has to do with coordination and collaboration and kind of co-imagination at scale. And part of what I mean by that can be seen in a project that was run during the Arab Spring in Tunisia, called 16th of June 2014, or it was in French and Arabic. So in French, 16 juin 2014, that was the hashtag that it traveled under. And that project was imagining in the midst of the turmoil in the wake of toppling a dictator, and it was unclear what the future state of the society was going to be. There was a day-long, I'm tempted to call it like a society-wide meta LARP, like live-action role-playing game, because in the press, on television, in social media and radio, various media brands collaborated in imagining that it was 3 years and 3 months, 3 years and 3 months into the future, and that Tunisia was as vibrant economically and civically as it had ever been, and so on and so forth. And by the end of that day, it was the #1 hashtag, not just in Tunisia, but for the first time in France as well. So, I mean, it rippled outward from there. And that kind of, the use of the platforms that we usually use for just reflecting or ostensibly reflecting reality back to us can also be used to reflect an alternative or series of alternative states of our society back to us. And I think that kind of co-imagining, cooperation and collaboration would be amazing to try in a place like Finland. I think it might actually be possible to do because of the scale. But to set an example of that kind, I think would be incredibly worthwhile. And then in relation to sort of, and you could apply that to all sorts of specific topics, as you might imagine. But then if we were to take one of these topics, say the relationship between the settler or colonial culture and indigenous peoples, I think the kind of experiment that's called for there has to do with establishing new forms of civic dialogue, so that the genocide, the grotesque injustice, the pain, the unfairness, all of those things can be actually talked about and acknowledged and begin to be remedied. I don't think that we have forums in which those things can happen, at least not visible at scale that I'm aware of. So I think that's a site of experimentation that is critical to support. And it puts me in mind of my colleague Annette Mee's work on the Future Assembly and the Future Almanac, which was a kind of experimental container for conversation across generations that she ran in Britain a number of years ago. But I think in Finland specifically, there is a tradition that can be built on of open dialogue. I'm not using that just as a general term. There's a specific process called open dialogue associated with the work of Jaakko Seikkola and Tom Arnkill in particular. And it would be amazing to talk with them and people in their communities of practice about how to apply the learning from their psychiatric and social work contexts to these broader societal discussions that have to happen. Well, to make the collaboration on a whole of society transmedia basis viable, we would need to engage, the owners and managing editors of newspapers and TV channels and all the sites where people tell themselves the story of what is going on in their society. We could be partnering with those same channels to tell another story and to ask what if. In relation to a thematic focus on a renegotiation of the cultural and political relationships between settler cultures and indigenous ones, the culture bearers and elders and representatives, one way or another, of traditional societies need to be in the room, and that's an exciting and difficult prospect in itself, but it's one that I think Untitled needs to tackle if it's going to make inroads on what really matters culturally. The question I'd like to ask of the Untitled community at the moment is a question for introspection, and it's how might the visions and voices that are currently marginalized or missing from conversations about futures be foregrounded in this effort? And the other part is, whose futures and interests are we currently serving? A third question I'd like to ask the Untitled community is, how might we help you with the 15 or so years of experiential futures background and experimentation in all sorts of different contexts and with different kinds of story and different kinds of audience? We'd love to be of service and partnership as these explorations continue.